So Simon, welcome to the Better World Leaders podcast. Thank you very much for coming along.
Thank you for having me on board, Tim.
So Simon and I have known each other for some time, but haven't spoken for a while. So when we had a conversation a few weeks ago on the premise of would Simon like to come and have a conversation here, it was a good catch up, and I think it's fair to say we've both grown and moved into some interesting territory since we saw each other last, which I'm going to say was probably maybe 5 or 6 years ago at least, because I don't think either of us had children then.
In that ballpark. That's right.
Yeah. So Simon, just to sort of set the ball rolling, and a typical sort of first question at Better World Leaders, where did you come from? What's the journey that you've been on to get you here today?
The long, medium, or short version.
Well, let's say the medium version, since this is
let's go for
podcast.
Medium. I'll sort of weave a few threads in. I'm a Kiwi. I've got a father who is an oceanographer. Travelled a lot when I was young, and also sort of developed an awareness of the world's various systems. I probably knew about plate tectonics before most kids. and so grew up tuned into what was happening in the environment, and at the same time became very interested in the built environment and in architecture, and so trained for and became an architect, but one that was very, very interested in sustainability. And so 20 odd years ago, when I moved to Australia from New Zealand, I was working for a large architecture practice, and things that just seem sort of bleeding obvious, like the orientation of buildings towards the sun, were considered sort of a radical innovation in industry. Perhaps I'm overstating that, but it was considered a new thing and certainly wasn't common practice. And so I started specializing in the question of what would make sustainable design, sustainable buildings, and to improve our cities, the quality of our buildings, in concert with the environment, dealing with issues like climate change, resource security, etc. And so I began to specialize in that as an architect, but then was approached by a company in the property sector. And so that was a shift from how do we design singular buildings to how do we affect markets, which was really attractive. The Green Building Council was being created back then, and we had just had the Sydney Olympics, the Green Olympics, and various companies, builders and various property groups and designers, etc., had started on this journey. But we really did need to create a sort of a systemic shift in the market. And so I worked for this property services company and headed up sustainability for them and navigated that for a number of years. But at the heart of the question for me was, how do we take sustainability, and I don't like using this bit of jargon, but I'm going to use it anyway, and really put it into the DNA of organizations. And it's not just then an organization doing a bit of sustainability with vulnerable products or service lines, etc. It is about how do we create sustainable organizations. And so I headed out on my own as an independent, which gave me the flexibility I needed to really follow my nose. It was a bit of a brave new world, but I think it's worked out. And I started working with a variety of different clients and sort of accelerating my learning. Now, that was good. In 2011, I started working very, very closely with a global property group out of the UK. And we're creating a global level strategy around sustainability. They wanted to go deep. They were a company with a lot of history, a lot of stewardship around the built environment in cities like London, and wanted to carry that forward over the long term. So that was a great opportunity, and we worked on that strategy. But a few years later, in 2014, I got a call from the group head of technology, and they were trying to map the digital space.
Yeah, right.
and were struggling. They were going to leading sort of technology advisors of the ilk of sort of IBM, Gartner, maybe not those ones, I can't recall, and getting tech speak. So the executives weren't getting their heads around what this meant. And so they asked me to do it with them. And I worked, first of all, I said I didn't know anything about digital.
Sure.
And they said,
Well, have a go.
I'll have a go. Well, I was upfront. But part of the purpose in approaching me is they wanted it unpacked in layperson's terms. So
Yes,
I
yes.
worked very closely with this group head of technology, and we created a map of how digital technologies were impacting cities, real estate, and their global business, from funds management to asset ownership to development, etc. And that was a bit of a rude awakening, because I got all of these jigsaw pieces around all sorts of different digital technologies, from AI to augmented reality, autonomous vehicles, BIM, blockchain, big data, in the context of cities, real estate, and property groups. Got those jigsaw pieces out on the table and realized that this was much, much bigger and more consequential than I saw industry appreciating, that I saw society, government appreciating. And it really dawned on me that we're making a step change with regards to digitalisation. And by we, I mean our species, our various societies around the world, as well as our economy and our businesses. And it required a whole new way of thinking, including looking at it through a sustainability lens. So I'll stop right there, but there is a maybe a medium level sort of snapshot of how I got to this point, and my current exploration around sustainable digitalisation.
No, it was a great depiction. I'm glad I didn't go for the short version, because I think that that was just right. And I have to say, but my personal curiosity says, well, I want to hear the long version at some point, and maybe we could do that. But I think it's a fascinating journey, and I know it's our key topic today, and I can't wait to get there. But I'm just going to hold myself back for a moment from diving straight off the board and into this deep and at the moment sort of fairly dark pool of sustainable digitization. I could probably, hopefully I'll be able to pronounce that by
there's a lot of syllables in that.
There are.
It was a real concern when we chose that term, but it's sticking on people's tongues after a while.
It's memorable, even if it's not pronounceable. But look, I think it's interesting, the sort of the conglomeration of skills and perspectives that you've gained through all of those different chapters that you've just, sort of run rapid fire through, sort of growing up, sort of in different, sort of realms of the world, and with an oceanographer, sort of opening your eyes and, setting your perspectives on systems complexity and, sort of long-term, sort of impact and those kind of things, as well as just the sort of, so these two plates, when they rub together, this stuff we call the ground shakes a lot, right? Your perspective's been, sort of defined strategically in a way, I think, which is now obviously very much informing, a lot of your work, and then taking the built environment, which I think certainly the tendency is to, to think of it as a fixed, sort of very tangible, almost a sort of a statuesque, sort of element of our world. A building is a thing that's going to be there for a while, and maybe in 50 years we might knock it down and put a better one up. But the overlaying of that perspective of how you design the flow through the built environment and how you enable societies and cultures to interact within it and through it, and sort of leveraging it, now to apply that to the digital sphere, which has lots of sort of similar elements. There's stations and there's gathering points and there's spaces and there's conduits, but there's also similar risks and there's similar opportunities and vulnerabilities. So I think this is going to be a fascinating exploration of what awaits us in the world, and of course, not to forget, the role within this all that leaders will play. So let's follow this bouncing ball and head down the path of, here we go, sustainable digitization. Got it.
Got it. Well, no, you didn't. Digitalisation. Did you say digitalisation or digitisation?
Let's just say I was close. So what's this all about? Let's just give us a high level. What is sustainable digitization all about?
Yeah, look, I produced a publication in sort of 2017, 2018, and we called it Crossing the Threshold. And what it's saying is that humankind right now is crossing a threshold into a digitalized future. You know, the application of digital technologies, the use of data, etc. It is a structural change. It's a lot bigger than we might experience day to day, where often technology sort of incrementally evolves around us and with us. And I think it's a lot bigger than how we often think about digital disruption, which is often related to as events that might happen with a product or a business which disrupt it, and it's a very serious threat and of great consequence. But that is still a microcosm of something much, much larger that is happening. And you know, there's forums like the World Economic Forum, which I think is really appreciating the magnitude of that shift. And you can appreciate it when you start to think about how we're actually re-engineering the human being. And so we're bioengineering, we're playing with CRISPR now, we're re-engineering other species now. And even we talk about augmented reality and often sort of think, oh, that's a special pair of glasses, or, you know, we think about chipping and, you know, putting chips in our hands, and hear the case studies of the businesses that encourage employees to do that. But it's all much more closer to home than we might think. When we use our smartphones, we are augmenting ourselves right now. So we're accelerating down a pathway where we are evolving our species very, very quickly. When you look at a city, there is a rapid and aggressive move to deploy a lot of technology in the city, in our buildings, and it's a real source of competition. You know, a city wants to demonstrate that it's the most technologically enabled city, attracting the smartest people in technology around the world. It's an innovation hub, etc. And if you're an owner of an office building, for example, you are competing for tenants in part based on the technological enablement of that building, and indeed the businesses in them are racing in that way as well. You know, and it could be fintech or regtech or, you know, property groups, which I work very closely with. It's all prop tech, which is a sort of an investment class in its own right. So we're in this space where the wheels are spinning. We're moving very, very quickly. There's a lot of hype, and if we step back, we can see that this is just a period in the evolution of our species, and it is an enormous step change, and it does need to be stewarded very, very carefully. So what Sustainable Digitalisation simply says is that shift needs to be responsible, it needs to be ethical, it needs to be sustainable. And just like many things in business today and in governance today, we need to put an ESG lens on it. We need to look at environmental consequences, we need to look at social consequences, and we need to look at governance consequences. And the final point I'll make about it just now is we need to remember that digitalisation is a double-edged sword. It offers us tremendous benefits, and some of them are entirely frivolous. I'm blown away by people who photograph their breakfasts and put that into social media. I don't know what proportion of the internet is full of people's breakfasts and who's watching that, but you know, there's a lot of flippancy around the use of technology, but we also live in a world that is global, is highly complex, with many wicked problems like climate change, and we need the sophistication of technology to help solve those problems. And so we really must pursue digitalisation, but the other edge of the sword is it presents risks, and many of them are very, very severe, and many of them are not being addressed effectively today. And one of my favorite examples about that is the enormous one-day share price drop in Facebook. It was sometime last year, I think sometime in the middle of the year, it dropped to 119 billion US dollars in one day. In gross, the biggest fall of a stock in history. And that was on the back of a warning about a reduction in the rate of growth, not a reduction overall, just a reduction in the rate of growth of their membership, which largely stemmed from what was happening in Europe, all of which was on the back of the crisis they had around privacy, which is a social issue. Up until that point, it was an externality for them. And the market was realizing that that was going to be really consequential to their value, and the wheels of the market spun, and we saw that enormous price drop. And I think that really talks to the moment in which we're in. We're both going through this enormous structural change, but at the same time, there is also this awakening that, just like with many other things beforehand, like the production of energy with climate change consequences, there's a whole load of issues that we need to begin to consider around digitalisation. And that is to make sure it's responsible, ethical and sustainable, which we call Sustainable Digitalisation for short.
No, I mean, it's such a fascinating topic with so many connotations and permeations. And I'll just reflect on a couple of things. I mean, that the whole Cambridge Analytica sort of Facebook, we won't touch on the sort of the political, sort of, saga that sort of broke the sort of the cap on that whole sort of ongoing relationship has been a fascinating one, and I think privacy is typically the long dark shadow that's cast over any kind of tech development now, but as you say, it really does go a lot deeper and broader than simply consumer protection around privacy, which is in itself a vast and complex topic. So I'm really glad that we've got the opportunity to explore it, even just at a high level, across some of the breadth of those areas. And I think I certainly, if I go back maybe 3, even 4 years, I'm racking my brain now, but I can't think of a single conversation that I would have had with a senior executive in any of the permeations of the work that we do that would have referenced technology as anything other than a positive and a net gain with some sort of outage risk. But if the server goes down, that was kind of the worst case scenario, is you'll have kind of a loss of engagement, which is going to have a real sort of monetary and brand impact for sure. But it wasn't about things like cybersecurity, digital disruption of your existing income stream from a strategic sense. Whereas in the last 2 years, I've had 2 clients who've had significant negative impact on their business because of cyber intrusion. Full shutdown, the sort of the ransomware goes in, and it's been a really interesting journey to be on with them, coaching them through that experience as they're working with federal authorities and global, sort of regulatory bodies to try and figure out, the source of the intrusion and how they can recover it, and so on and so on. And then you play that out to the societal level around how privacy can be exploited and how data can be, sort of used in a way which was not what we signed up for. And then we look at it, from the perspective of a city or a global system. I mean, there's a lot in there, but just also briefly to reflect back on, technology as an advantage and a need to move towards it and to invest in it, but to do so in the right way. I look at no further than Adelaide, which is a distance from where you and I sit, but Adelaide within my team stands out. We have one of our team who sits in Adelaide CBD. The rest of us are spread around the rest of Australia and the US. And the sort of stability and the speed at which that person in Adelaide can work and manage content, and the stability of their bandwidth for Zoom calls, which we've obviously been doing a lot of late, is second to none, because Adelaide made a strategic investment, as a city, to be a hub, an innovation center, and so on and so on. And then as a state, at a state governmental level, to make that center renewable and sustainable, and they have their solar farms and their Tesla batteries and so on and so on. So it is interesting to see the pace at which that's moving, and the ACT are kind of heading there, but there's a lot more work that needs to be done. And that's probably another 5 conversations in of itself.
Well, that's right. It's very interesting. And South Australia is an interesting case study, but the question of foresight, what should we be looking to with regards to this? And look, from what you just said, there's all sorts of very interesting topics, but the question of trust, I think, is one I would like to
let's go there.
Let's
spend some time on trust.
I mentioned the World Economic Forum. I remember watching a chat between Klaus Schwab and Mark Benioff. Klaus Schwab being the founder of the World Economic Forum and the author of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, and Mark Benioff being the founder and chairman, or was he CEO of Salesforce. I hope I got that right. Was he the founder?
He was definitely involved with Salesforce.
He's two of those things. He heads Salesforce, put it that way. I think he's the CEO and chairman, perhaps. But it was a fascinating conversation because it was about the Fourth Industrial Revolution and how we should take our organisations forward. And I walked away from watching it with a sense that every second word in that conversation was trust. They said it dozens of times. And the city of Sydney, for me, is a very interesting case study. I think it is doing very, very well around sustainability, very, very well in terms of engaging its community, and is putting a lot of care into how it deals with digitalisation. And it was pointed out to me that the city has 12 key indicators as an organisation, and one of them is trust. And they go out to the community, including the business community, and measure that. And it's increased year on year on year on year on year. And trust really is the oil that lubricates the digital world, or the digitalized world, both things actually. And what we are seeing is other examples where trust has not existed around the use of digital technologies, and they've fallen over. So in the last couple of weeks, we saw a project in Toronto which was called Sidewalk Labs, and that was branded by it was called Sidewalk Toronto. It was branded by Sidewalk Labs, which is the urban analytics business of Alphabet, sits alongside Google, being the online sort of analytics business. They're sort of brother and sister businesses. One's a lot bigger than the other, but they both appreciate the value of data. And Sidewalk Labs had got into this position of kind of being in the box seat to develop a piece of the Toronto Portlands. And it was going to be a highly sophisticated project technology-wise. It was going to offer unparalleled environmental benefits, a whole load of social benefits. But there was a huge backlash from the community who just asked a ton of questions. So what happens to our data? How are we monitored? Does this data go offshore out of Canada? Could it eventually end up with Google? What's the role of the city of Toronto in this, et cetera, et cetera? And it really highlighted a schism between what is possible with technology and where the community is really at. And there wasn't trust to negotiate that, and the project stalled and was shrunk. And in the last couple of weeks, Sidewalk Labs pulled out. And perhaps we've seen a similar thing with the COVID Safe app in Australia.
Yeah, I was just about to say.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So many of us know that we need it. We don't know necessarily yet whether it's effective. There doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence around that. That's a question. But in theory, the ability to track I think most of us would appreciate as a core plank of our ability to manage the virus in the community up to the point at which we can get a vaccination in place. But not a lot of people have downloaded it. It sort of got to around 5 million downloads or not. I don't know whether people have downloaded it and are using it. And it's sort of stalled in numbers. And I did one survey with a group of people, and there was a lot of distrust around the government with regards to their data and privacy. And there is a perversion, which many of us acknowledged, that, hey, this is a relatively safe platform that they're proposing compared to many others that we flippantly engage in day to day. But there wasn't trust in our institution. So here we are in this tragic situation, really, where we supposedly really need this for the good of our society and the good of our economy, but we're not adopting it broadly because of the lack of trust. And I think, you know, it really is a totem for how we deal with digitalisation going forward, how we, you know, it's a key area for foresight because it takes time to build trust. And so, yeah, some people say you can't actually build it, you earn it. So it's kind of a stupid phrase. And it's something that we really need to start thinking about right now through applying a responsibility and ethical sort of lens to digitalisation. And the organisation, I'll just add, the organisations, the cities, the governments that really pay attention to that, I believe will outcompete in time. You know, we're seeing, you know, Facebook really struggle with this. So many people say that Zuckerberg just keeps on apologising, but yet they don't get a sense that intrinsically the change is occurring. But we are also seeing amongst big tech a real proliferation of initiatives around privacy. Some of it provoked, no doubt, by GDPR and their ability to engage in European markets, but a lot of it's probably out of fear of antitrust as well, and just a recognition that, hey, we urgently need to demonstrate that we are good corporate citizens and we're trustworthy, because they know the power and the value of the data, and the community is only just beginning to awaken to that, and that will normalize over time.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much in there. I mean, I recall, I'm going to say probably now 2 years ago, you know, listening to a podcast, which was a business podcast, but it was specifically, you know, talking about scalable tech and the advantages at a societal level, and they were applauding, you know, the Cyborg Labs as an example of, you know, what great looks like, and this is at the forefront, this is at the cutting edge, and this is essentially what everybody should be doing. And it's so interesting what the outcome of that experiment, if we call it that, has been. There were a couple of things, a couple of bells that kept chiming whilst you were sort of discussing the whole, you know, sort of significance of trust and how it's conveyed digitally, and I'll just outline a couple of topics, and then we can sort of decide, you know, so whether we want to explore any of them or which one. If so, we'll start with, I think absolutely there's an institutional trust crisis. I mean, globally, yeah, you look at whether it's a federal or a non-federal government system, but, you know, trust in governments globally is at a very, very low ebb. I don't know if it's at a record low, but it's at a low. Also, educational institutions, you know, the criticism of schools and universities, you know, to prepare citizens for the future and to sort of do what, you know, sort of parents and communities want done, you know, sort of in terms of, you know, sort of developing their children. That also, I think, is really, you know, sort of going through not quite a crisis, but a real challenge time at the moment. And then what seems to be interesting is, you know, where there's a, you know, sort of an ebb, obviously you get a flow, you know, that vacuum needs to be filled. So what we're seeing is an increase in trust in brands, which are, of course, primarily corporates, or this sort of, you know, very spurious term, influencers. You know, if you were to go, You go and do a survey.
Hard not to laugh when you think of
Oh, you have
influencers.
to, right? Like, so what exactly is an influencer, and what do they know? And yeah,
What's that
exactly. And
gonna
who's
do?
fact checking that selfie? Anyway,
What is that?
but it's curious, isn't it, that at a societal level, that's where the trust vacuum, or that's where the trust flow is going, and that's where the trust vacuum is being filled. But I think you look at examples such as the bushfires, which are very prominent, in my mind still here months on, having sort of been so closely involved with them on the South Coast. We saw corporates and influences moving faster, messaging better, more compellingly than certainly I would contend the federal government here, and quite sort of arguably the state government as well, with the exception of the outstanding institution of the Royal Fire Service and the leadership there doing by far and away the best job of anyone. But there was a lot of positive resonance around what brands were doing. Look at this corporate that's donating this, or is doing this, or whatever. Look at this influencer, a comedian who's going to raise $60 million or whatever it was. Let's not get into what that money is going to end up being spent on. But these are exactly where these issues play out, right? Here's a nice, sort of very well-intended, sort of click through on your Instagram feed that's asking you to orientate your attention, let alone ask for your money to go towards a cause that you agree with. But it's a person or a company, not a government, asking for your attention and your money, and you're more inclined because you trust them more than you do the other side. So Simon, if I just interject with a question at a high level, but so how do the organizational leaders go about sort of engaging with these issues?
Yeah, look, there's that's a great opener as a question. And there is quite a smorgasbord of pathways there. I guess one is to start thinking about their relationship with technology. And I mentioned the structural change that was occurring. I referenced the fourth industrial revolution, which is a frame that a lot of business leaders like to use.
Yeah, absolutely.
It puts it into a useful framework. But it is a bit like trying to come to terms with climate change, which is a deep systemic change happening close to us, but very, very remotely, with a transparent, odorless gas, etc., or a number of gases, and is very, very nuanced, and it really does begin to reference belief systems, which certainly climate change has in our society. You can have the facts, and people, due to their belief systems, may or may not engage with those facts. Technology can be very, very similar. The catch with technology is we are deeply immersed in it, and so it is kind of the water in which we are swimming. Sometimes we might reflect on where technology was 10 years ago, prior to even having smartphones. Or I was joking the other day about bander machines with people. Or somebody tried to negotiate something with an energy utility, and they said, your letter needs to be handwritten. Can you imagine handwriting a letter? Often we sort of reflect back to those points, but we don't. We're otherwise consumed with it, and we are constantly sort of updating our smart technology around us, and it evolves. We don't really see the trajectory that we are on or where it's going. One concern about technology that is raised a lot by leading thinkers around it is that there is a way of thinking which is a technologist's filter on the world.
Yeah.
And it says that we can solve any problem with technology. It says that any problem can be codified, it can be put into an algorithm. And indeed, a lot can, and huge gains can be made through pursuing that, but that is deeply problematic. And we know that human beings are, we're not machines. A lot of people say, oh, well, the human brain is just a machine, while many people would argue otherwise. The way in which society works is highly, highly complex, and working with that condition is highly, highly necessary to navigate deep societal problems. And so we really need to be able to take a step back from technology and just be able to, like any effective business leader or governance leader is able to take the helicopter view. He or she can step out of the business, out of the body that they're governing, and see it for what it is. We need to do the same with technology. And at a societal, and even a species level, we need to ensure that technology is a tool in our hands, and we're not falling into the trap of being slaves to the technology. And when you see those same people photographing their breakfast for social media, that's it's a bit of a canary in the mind, I think, or possibly in the mind as well as the mind. It is very, very easy to just be swept along with technology. And indeed, there is so much power and so much wealth with technology companies. We need to, and they can apply that sort of technologist lens on the world. We need to carefully navigate that. They can be very, very important institutions in our economy and our society going forward, but we need to, I think, develop a much more intimate relationship between society and those institutions. And we can almost step back and I have heard it said that part of the structural step change that we're going through right now is a renegotiation of the social contract. The tripartite contract between the public, between the private sector, and between government.
Yeah.
Around the stuff. And we've spoken a bit about privacy. It's only one of many issues. But issues like privacy, that is a human right. And in a country like Australia, and I know you have listeners all over the world, but in a lot of societies, it is a human right that we take for granted. But we've reached a point where we're questioning that, and data rights, we're really beginning to negotiate what they really mean. And we know that some people go to a shopping centre now and they get the message on the smartphone saying, welcome to such and such a centre, here's some offers and shops to visit. And we know that facial detection and facial recognition is being used in such places. We're butting up against this stuff again and again, and the COVID apps are another sort of bellwether for this thing. So we really need to think very carefully as leaders of governmental institutions and of business and of businesses around how we negotiate that. It needs to be done with trust, and sort of back to the beginning of this piece, if you like. It really does start by leaders and indeed organizations questioning their relationship to technology and really putting technology into its place.
So the question that I'd like to follow with here is, do you see this as being sort of a pivotal sort of role for leaders at the highest levels, the appointed governmental officials, the C-suite, the board of directors, and it's up to them to hopefully with sort of organizations like those that you work with, to sort of divine the right way, and then everybody, sort of then follows suit? Or is it more, sort of comprehensive, and is it more to do with leadership at sort of any level, basically sort of being conscious of your use and your own clamoring for development of technological resources and processes, etc., and be mindful essentially of what you're asking for, but then also funnel the messages upwards as well, because the decisions are only as good as the data, as the phrase goes.
Look, it's absolutely bottom up, top down. It is, and it's the only way to do it. If you really want to harness the power of an organization, you need to have the diversity of an organization, including experience types and influence types within organizations, and also the collective sensitivity of the organization. So much of my work before really going down the sustainable digitalization space was around sustainability in organizations, as I alluded to at the beginning of our chat. And that for me was heavily about weaving many threads together. It was finding the big touch points for a board. It was finding the points of risk. It was finding the points of opportunity. It was engaging relevant business lines. And throughout it all, it was creating a groundswell in the workforce, because that sort of, in many ways, collected the most signals, be it personal signals. And we're I've mentioned big tech a lot. I probably didn't mean to, but we are seeing in companies like Google real internal movements arising, where the workforce is saying, "Hey, here's some social issues of concern. Let's shape from within." But also the workforce is often most deeply tuned into the stakeholders. They hold all of the relationships, and they would have the most immediate readings on where stakeholders are at. I mentioned shopping centres. It could be the centre management team who are administering this technology and are receiving some feedback. Maybe they're using surveillance technology and overhearing what people are actually saying as they receive those alerts on their phones, perhaps. But it then becomes the opportunity to have your workforce lead much more sophisticated conversations with those stakeholders, and begin to unpack what is going on, and allow much greater flow of insight into the organization. So look, my very strong view is it really has to be across the board. But that said, you do often need incubated areas of innovation. You do need to allow spaces for ideas to develop deeply often, and you do need to have the champions in that system to carry it all forward and coordinate.
Yeah, very much so. No, I think, that very much aligns with a lot of the work that we do, around culture. And it's one thing, to have a fantastic, new CEO come in and say, this is what, I believe in, and this is why I'm here. And, I very much want us to live by the values of the organization, and therefore let's go create a great culture. But ultimately, if that's not embraced and is not, sort of driven from the bottom back up, then essentially you don't ever get the meeting in the middle, and nothing really happens. I think one question I'd like to ask now is if we've really piqued someone's curiosity about this incredibly complex realm, are there any sort of shining lights for you? Any let's start as big as countries or cities or organizations that you feel are really nailing this, and that would be a good starting point if somebody wanted to go and look at essentially best practice, and then start to unpack, well, how do we start to sort of transition in that direction? When you mentioned the city of Sydney already, I'm sure that they would have public domain stuff that one could go and look up. But are there any others that stand out to you?
Yeah, the City of Sydney example is more of an intrinsic one. I don't know whether you'd find published case studies on this. I've just seen them connecting many of the dots around these issues
Sure.
and putting things like trust with stakeholders as a primary indicator is a great thing to do. What, you know, as I mentioned, a real movement around this stuff is occurring around the world. And so we're seeing think tanks and organizations and government-led initiatives and private sector-led initiatives pop up all over the place. You know, there's one group of initiatives which is very prevalent, which is around ethics in AI. As a sort of as a microcosm, and so I read lately that there are about 70 different sets of principles for ethics in AI that have been developed. There's a lot of work around responsibility, ethics in technology. The Ethics Centre put out a beautiful publication 2 years ago now. I lose track. I think it was 2 years ago now, 2018 it came out, on good technology and principles for that. I think that's a beautiful reference. There's an excellent group a centre that has been launched under the Australia Institute called the Centre for Responsible Technology. And they're progressively leading some really rich discourse around this. Also in Australia, the Human Rights Commission is leading a very important initiative around the relationship between human rights and technology, and that is led by Ed Santow, the Human Rights Commissioner. He's taken that under his wing personally. We've also seen a lot of universities create units around this sort of topic as well, and I think you'd probably be able to pick up any university and find something. I'm also leading an initiative called the Sustainable Digitalisation Project, or the SDP, which is an increasingly large collaboration stemming out of the property sector, but engaging other sectors such as investment, such as construction, infrastructure, and also intercities, starting with groups like the City of Sydney, which is looking at sustainable digitalisation for real estate in cities. Ultimately, it's all about cities, and we are working out how to better define this agenda for different stakeholder groups. We're working on a set of principles. Right now, there's 5 core principles that are defining sustainable digitalisation, and indeed are probably very useful outside of the sort of built environment space. There's also an initiative into defining what good looks like for cities, so what goals cities should be shooting for with regards to responsible, ethical, sustainable outcomes with digitalisation. There's one around properties and how we assess the level of responsibility with the use of technologies and properties, which are, as I mentioned earlier on, they're accelerating. We're deploying a lot of technology in properties, and they're no longer a dumb pile of sort of steel, glass, and concrete. They are becoming pieces of technology in their own right, and indeed many of them now have digital twins. They both exist in the real world and in the virtual world. So how do we ensure that vendors are doing the right thing when they offer the technology, through to a tenant being able to compare different properties? We're working on that. And also investment in real assets, real estate and infrastructure. What indicators should investors be working with? And so we've started engaging investors to understand where their thinking is currently at. And we know that different investors are dealing with different digitalisation-driven ESG issues. and we will create a set of indicators which they can then sort of push down their supply chain, so that they are, in particular, dealing with investment risks associated with this, and grabbing opportunities along the way.
And look, I mean, having spent a little bit of time on the SDP site, in preparation for today's conversation, I would certainly be steering people there. There's a lot of information there, including the crossing the threshold, sort of white paper, if we can call it that. That I think would be, it is very detailed for sure, but I think that would be a good starting point, for anybody that's, listened to this and thinks, great, where can I find out more, or where can I go next? And I'm presuming that, you'd be open to people, sort of reaching out to you or expressing an interest, certainly if they're, happen to be running a major city or, maybe major global conglomerate, you'd be open to hearing from them?
Oh, we're pleased to hear from anybody to engage in the conversation. If you're running a city, fantastic. If you're involved in the property sector or infrastructure, so you may well be involved in the built environment, or we've got technology leaders from the health sector, for example, getting involved. So please reach out, and we're happy to. Happy to help you explore your exploration of this agenda.
Perfect. Well, look, I'll have Simon's contact details in the show notes. So you just scroll down a little bit on whatever device you are hopefully very sustainably holding as you listen to this, and you can reach out to Simon directly there. Simon, that's been a fascinating and I think very informative exploration of an incredibly interesting and complicated and fast evolving topic. So thank you very much for your time. It's certainly for me, but I hope for everybody listening, it's been a pleasure talking with you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tim. It's been fun.
You'll find audio and video recordings for this episode, as well as links and related resources mentioned today in the podcast area of 4iLeadership.com/insights. This is the Better World Leaders podcast, brought to you by 4i Leadership.